I think you're exactly right here. There's three counts, and they all relate to false statements on a federal form in which Hunter Biden purchased weapons. And he said, I am not using drugs, when in fact he was using drugs. And I think you were exactly right to point out that this was part of that plea agreement that fell apart, and fell apart in a way that was so um, unexpected, in the sense that plea agreements, particularly on the federal level, don't fall apart. And as we remember, what happened is that the judge said to the Department of Justice, essentially, is this it? And they said, maybe not. And Hunter Biden's attorney said, what do you mean? There might be more. The other thing, and I think this is key for this indictment, is that the judge really questioned why the plea agreement included both the tax charges and these gun charges in the way that they did. What was previously offered to Hunter Biden is that he could avoid jail time for these gun charges if he entered a diversion program, basically, if he stayed out of trouble for 2 years.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington, and we are coming on the air because Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, has just been indicted by a federal grand jury on gun charges. In July, Mr. Biden had entered into a tentative plea agreement with the Justice Department, but remember that deal fell apart after a U.S. district judge in Delaware posed questions regarding the diversion agreement that would have absolved Mr. Biden of a felony gun charge. This indictment comes a week after the Department of Justice Special Counsel David Weiss indicated to the court that his office would charge Mr. Biden before the end of the month. Let's bring in our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge, who joins us now. All right, 3 counts in this indictment, correct?
Yes, what the indictment lays out is that they allege the president's son, when he had the paperwork that has to be filed to obtain a weapon, that he said on the form that he was not an unlawful user of drugs. And what he stipulated to during that July plea hearing, which collapsed, is that it was a false statement. So
just to back up for those who haven't been following it very closely, Hunter Biden, who was an admitted drug user and is now in therapy for that. He bought a gun, and when you buy a gun, you have to fill out ATF forms, and you have to lawfully state that you are not a drug user using substances. He lied on those forms.
Yes, that's right. What strikes me about the indictment is that he is being prosecuted for being sort of an unlawful or prohibited person from obtaining a weapon, but I don't see what they call here a false statement charge, which was one of the issues that was raised by the court back in July, because it can be a two-pronged prosecution, one for the possession, and then also for the false statement on the form.
All right. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, who is there. And Nancy, many people close to the Bidens had predicted that this indictment would come at some point. Your reading of the indictment and the reaction there?
Well, we're unlikely to get much reaction, Nora, here at the White House. We've asked, but they typically try to stay as far as they possibly can from Hunter Biden's legal issues. When pressed, when asked, the president has always said that he's proud of his son, that he stands by his son. But as for White House officials themselves, they insist that the White House has nothing to do with DOJ's prosecution of this case, and they don't want to create the appearance that they're putting their thumb on the scale in any way. So they're unlikely to say much. Obviously, where things get muddy is where this situation overlaps with the ongoing impeachment effort by some Republicans in the House of Representatives. Just this week, the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy announced that he would be opening an impeachment inquiry, arguing that there are allegations that the president benefited in some way from his son's overseas business dealings. And what the White House has argued is that Republicans have already been investigating this for 9 months. And while they have turned up allegations, they have not turned up any actual evidence that the president did anything wrong.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. We should note that David Weiss, a U.S. attorney who was appointed by Donald Trump, has been investigating Hunter Biden since 2018. Just recently, his position was elevated to special counsel by the Attorney General Merrick Garland. The news at this hour is that Hunter Biden, the son of the president, has been indicted in a Delaware federal court of 3 counts tied to the possession of a gun while using narcotics. 2 counts are tied to the fact that Hunter Biden allegedly filed this form claiming that he was not using illegal drugs at the time of a purchase of a Colt Cobra revolver. That was in October 2018. The 3rd count alleges that he possessed a firearm while using a narcotic. I want to bring back in our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge. So, Catherine, what happened? This investigation has been going on a long time. There was supposed to be this plea agreement. What was in that plea agreement? Why did it fall apart?
Well, if we head back to the end of July, we had the hearing in Delaware, Nora, and there were 2 elements to the plea agreement. One had to do with alleged tax violations, and then the other was for the gun charge, which would be dealt with under what's called the Diversion agreement, which meant that the president's son, if he abide by a set of terms, he would be able to wipe the slate clean at the end of those 2 years. It collapsed in the court for a very basic reason. There was no agreement between the prosecution and the defense about what it meant for the future and whether with this agreement, this was the end of the story. It closed the door on any future charges that related to his business dealings.
And the judge thought we can't do that.
That's correct. Yep. The judge, Mary Ellen Noreika, really weighed in and asked some very probing questions about an agreement that, in her own words, she called not standard terms. And that was the signal to me out of the gate that this plea agreement could really be desynced and go off the rails. I want to just mention that proceeding with the gun charges has a certain amount of jeopardy for special counsel Weiss. Up until now, Hunter Biden's legal team has argued that they believe the agreement on the gun charges is still valid. So what we can expect going forward is that there will be a legal challenge from his legal team as to whether charges can really be brought at this point. But Weiss has been very clear that he would seek this indictment and that he was under sort of the clock, which is why it's coming now under the speedy trial rule.
Now, if he has been indicted, and what kind of jeopardy now is Hunter Biden in terms of this indictment?
Look, these are very serious gun charges, felony gun charges, based on my research, and that can bring very hefty fines as well as jail time. It seems pretty clear to me that this could provide some leverage or incentive from the special counsel to Hunter Biden's team to try and reach a settlement on this issue alone. Because remember, the tax charges, the potential charges are still out there, and they would ultimately be brought, we think, in a whole nother jurisdiction, either the West Coast or here in Washington.
Not out of the Delaware, where this case is in particular. And what about those tax charges? What are some of the concerns with that? Where does the investigation stand on the tax charges?
Well, as you know from our reporting here at CBS News, we were first to highlight these IRS whistleblowers who claimed that the evidence supported more serious charges, felony tax charges, not just 2 misdemeanor tax charges, which is what then U.S. Attorney David Weiss originally agreed to do in that plea agreement. So will they be felony tax or will they still be misdemeanor? But as you rightly pointed out, that there was this desyncing of the deal over the fact there could be other charges, and that could encompass something called FARA, which is lobbying on behalf of a foreign government without registering with the U.S. government.
And that is something I know that certainly they're going to be exploring in that impeachment inquiry as well, a different thing that just happened this week. Again, on these federal gun charges, 3 indictments at this hour. That is the breaking news. These 3 counts tied to the possession of a gun while using narcotics. Does the president's son face jail time?
He could well face jail time under this scenario. It's interesting to me that the special counsel has brought this charge first because based on my reporting over the last few months, this really in some ways is the cleanest charge. It's a paperwork case, as you rightly point out. They say he lied on the form. They allege he lied on the form. During the plea hearing at the end of July, he admitted that it was a false statement. So that's not really in question. The question is, could they plea it down to something less than something that could bring jail time or a very serious fine?
Catherine, thank you. Want to bring in a former federal prosecutor, Scott Frederickson. He joins us now on the phone. And Scott, as a former prosecutor, how serious are these charges?
Well, any federal felony is serious and carries potential for jail time. But that said, these are minor charges, especially the fact that you will rarely see a charge of a false statement in a gun application brought by itself without additional allegations of using a gun in some kind of violent crime. Jurors don't take false application statements that seriously. The jury will hear that this is probably happens 1,000 times every day in the country when someone doesn't disclose marijuana or something like that. We'll expect to see a motion to dismiss based on the defense saying there was a plea agreement and they want to enforce it. So we'll see some fireworks, but in a penal plea, things are not the most serious of felonies.
All right, Scott, thank you. I want to bring back in Nancy Cordes at the White House. And Nancy, since Hunter Biden has faced increased scrutiny of late, we have not seen President Biden distancing himself from his son, correct?
Not at all. We see them going on vacation together. Hunter Biden sometimes riding on Air Force One with the president. We've seen Hunter Biden here at the White House. And what White House officials argue is that, look, the president loves his son no matter what kind of trouble he's been in. The president and the first lady have always stood by him. They are glad that he has worked to get his life together and deal with his addictions. And they are not going to distance themselves from him in any way, even though obviously his legal travails have been a challenge for President Biden and even factored into his decision-making when he was trying to decide whether to run for president in the first place. He knew that this would be an issue.
Nancy, what about some of the statements that President Biden has made, some declarative statements like, my son has done nothing wrong?
Right. And he has said that in the past. We haven't heard him say anything like that recently. So I do think that that is notable. He's more careful now, either to sort of laugh off questions or simply say, you know, you have to ask DOJ. I support my son. I love my son. And I think that that is a recognition that that there is this dangerous line that he has to be careful not to cross, because he's been so adamant to argue that he runs this White House differently than his predecessor, that he doesn't try to lean on the Department of Justice to go after anyone or to go easy on anyone. That is the case that he's made all along. And so if he were to be making declarative statements like that, you know, coming out frequently saying my son shouldn't be prosecuted, my son didn't do anything wrong, that Republicans would argue, and I think even some Democrats would argue, would be putting his thumb on the scale.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. And just to let everyone know, the news at this hour, Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, has been indicted by a federal grand jury in Delaware on gun charges. This is according to court filings. There are 3 counts tied to the possession of a gun while using narcotics. This is a developing breaking news story, and our coverage will continue on CBS News streaming your local news. And tonight, we will have all the details on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington.
Our breaking news coverage continues. I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York. The president's son, Hunter Biden, has been indicted on federal gun charges. He now faces 3 counts related to possessing a firearm. Now, 2 counts are related to Biden claiming he was not using illegal drugs when he purchased a revolver back in October of 2018. This indictment comes after the collapse of a related diversion agreement back in July. You all will remember a judge saying, is this deal it? And that not being the case. You see on your screen Jessica Levinson. She's our legal contributor for CBS News and a professor at Loyola Law School. And Jessica, we just broke apart there as that special report began. And we heard from one expert saying it's unusual to see this type of indictment solely on the basis of false statements on a document where you're acquiring a gun. Just explain to us what these charges are.
My apologies. I think you laid it out very clearly here. There are 3 different charges. They all relate to the idea that Hunter Biden lied on a federal form. There's 2 charges relating to lying on a federal form, and then another charge related to being a drug user and possessing a gun when you're not supposed to. And what we're seeing here is the Department of Justice making good on their promise to indict Hunter Biden and to move forward just on these charges. Do I agree that you don't see these 3 felony charges standing alone very often? Absolutely. One thing I want to flag for people, because I don't know how long we have to talk about this today, this could actually set up a big Second Amendment battle, because what we know is that Hunter Biden, in his defense, now that we know he will put on a defense, it will not be a plea agreement. In his defense, he may argue that the laws that he is charged under are actually unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. Hunter Biden, therefore, in a very strange way, could be a spokesperson for stronger Second Amendment rights, while his father is leading an administration to try and increase gun control measures.
That's a really interesting point, because we did hear that Hunter Biden's legal team are likely to make a motion to dismiss. They will expectedly fight this. We're still reaching out to them and expecting to get a statement in any moment. But explain to us why you feel that that may be a logical next step. I mean, Hunter Biden has entered a program for his drug use. He was open and honest about that use, and he's now kind of on the path to recovery. So why would this indictment saying, well, wait a minute, when you purchased this weapon, you knew you were using drugs, you signed a form. I mean, the indictment's very clear. It says it's form 4473, and that claims that everything you're saying is correct. Why would charges based on this give him a foundation to say, well, wait a minute, I have a Second Amendment right?
The great question, a great clarifying question. And the answer is because what Hunter Biden is going to say is, well, you're charging me under a law that says that I needed to fill out this form, and you're charging me under a law that says as a drug user, I couldn't possess this gun. But I don't know if those laws can be on the books at all. So his defense won't be, that wasn't me, or that wasn't my signature, or I didn't lie. I suspect his defense will be, okay, what if I did all of that? I don't think you can enforce those 3 counts that we see in the indictment. I don't think you can enforce those against me or anybody else, because the Second Amendment includes the right to bear arms, and these particular requirements infringe on that right.
And is there anything else that jumps out at you from the charges as we see them in this indictment? And especially this happening now.
Yes. I mean, obviously, it's just impossible to disentangle the law from the politics. I will say to your first question, I do think it's the case that if you don't see Hunter Biden with the last name Biden, if you see him with the last name Smith, for instance, that you probably don't have this investigation, and therefore you may not have these charges be brought. It doesn't mean that he didn't commit these crimes. It doesn't mean that he won't be convicted. But I think that's to your question about, is it unusual to see 3 felony counts for this type of crime? And the answer is yes. Now, some people will say this isn't nearly enough, and there should be charges brought on federal lobbying, and this is just the beginning. And some people will say this is far too much, and he was under scrutiny because of who his father is.
Jessica Levinson with her perspective and analysis there, joining us from Los Angeles. We appreciate that. Stay close, Jessica. We've got much more coverage on this. We now want to cross over to the White House. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is there with the immediate reaction to this. This is the president's son. He's been vocal about supporting him through his struggles. What is the reaction where you are so far, Nancy?
No reaction yet, Errol. And when it comes, we don't expect that it will be expansive. Typically, the White House will issue a rather boilerplate statement that says the president supports his son, but that the White House won't have anything further to say because they don't want to influence the Department of Justice and its process and procedures. Yes, when asked, the president himself has said that he loves his son, that he supports him, that he's glad that he has dealt with his addictions and is getting his life back on track. But in recent months in particular, he's been very careful not to say anything about his son's guilt or innocence or anything about the case itself.
And what does that tell us? Because as you mentioned during our special report, the president used to be very quick and fast to say he supports his son and he's done nothing wrong. That has changed.
Yes, it's been quite some time since he said that, and it's clear that you know, in speaking with other White House officials, he was urged not to say anything like that because it could be seen as trying to influence the Department of Justice. Obviously, if the President of the United States is saying his son has done nothing wrong, that sends a signal to the Department of Justice that he expects that they won't do anything to pursue charges against Hunter Biden. And so in recent months, he hasn't said that. Instead, he simply says that he supports his son. And he has been very public about his support. We've seen them on vacation together. We've seen Hunter Biden here with his young family at the White House. And so there's no effort to sort of hide the relationship away. The president has made it clear he speaks to his son all the time. But it is simply that he doesn't want to speak publicly about the case. And of course, things get murky because the White House is asked not only about the president's views of this case, but also of the intersection between Hunter Biden's various legal and ethical travails and the impeachment inquiry that has just recently been opened by Republicans in the House on a very different issue. They say that they want to probe whether Hunter Biden's overseas business dealings ever influenced his father's policies in any way, either as vice president or as president, or whether Joe Biden benefited financially in any way from Hunter's business dealings. They haven't uncovered any evidence yet that that's the case, but they insist that if they just get more bank records, that somehow they will be able to make that connection. And so those investigations continue.
And just stand by with me for a moment, Nancy, as we are at 2 p.m. Eastern at the top of the hour as we continue to cover this breaking news that President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has now been handed an indictment from a Delaware federal grand jury, 3 counts related to statements made in connection with his possession and ownership of a gun. Nancy, we are expected to see the president later this hour on a separate topic discussing the economy. I'm not sure if there'll be an opportunity for him to take questions. Tell us where we expect to see the president and when will be the first opportunity for him to address this.
Sure. He's going to Largo, Maryland, by motorcade to deliver what the White House has billed as a major speech on Bidenomics, contrasting his economic platform with the Republican economic platform, or what he calls Maganomics. And we don't anticipate that he'll have anything to say in his public remarks about his son or these latest legal developments. And it's going to be somewhat tricky for reporters to get close enough to him today to ask him about it. And because there's no White House briefing today, because the president isn't here, we won't have an opportunity to put those questions on camera to the White House press secretary either. But we are asking White House officials behind the scenes if they have any reaction. I anticipate we'll get some kind of very basic statement from them at some point, and nothing more.
All right, Nancy Cordes joining us from the White House. Thank you for that. We want to continue this breaking news coverage with CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge at our D.C. bureau. Catherine, our viewers will have just witnessed the previous plea deal agreement over the summer, which fell apart in dramatic fashion when you joined us live to walk us through what was happening. You were in the courtroom. Connect the dots for us between Judge Mary Ellen Norica allowing that deal to fall apart and this indictment today.
Well, back at the end of July, Errol, there was the plea hearing in Delaware. There were 2 elements to the plea agreement. One was misdemeanor tax charges, and the second was a diversion agreement for a felony gun offense. Under that diversion agreement, the president's son would be able to wipe the slate clean in 2 years' time if he abided by the terms of that agreement. In its simplest terms, the deal fell apart after questions from the judge, Mary Ellen Norica, that revealed there was a fundamental disagreement between the 2 parties about whether the deal would shield the president's son from future prosecution on criminal charges related to his business dealings. Since the end of July, we've been having a back and forth between the parties. The court has dismissed the tax information. That's the tax part of the plea agreement. So if the special counsel wants to bring charges on tax, he'll have to take that to a grand jury to seek charges, likely in California or Washington, D.C. They've been arguing over the validity of the diversion agreement on the gun, and that has brought us to where we landed today. Last week, Special Counsel David Weiss told the Delaware court that he planned to seek an indictment in this element of the case, and that is what he's done in the last few days. The 3 charges, they have to do 2 with lying on the federal forms, and the last charge for possessing a gun while being a drug user. Of all of the charges that Weiss could bring, this is really the cleanest charge he can bring, because Hunter Biden has admitted to the court that the statements he made on the gun form were false. So that is really not the element that's in question.
What's interesting to me is this indictment is only 4 pages. It's pretty straight to the point, as you've spelled out what these charges are. Is there anything that jumps out to you about what is or is not in this indictment?
Well, I think it's instructive to actually look at the firearms transaction record. I have it right here. Lying on any kind of federal form like this is a very big deal. And in a lot of cases, that's what is the undoing of the defendant rather than the larger issue. And in this particular case, under item G, it asks, are you an unlawful user or addicted to marijuana or any antidepressant, stimulant, narcotic, drug, or any other controlled substance? And it's that element of the form that Hunter Biden said, I don't have those problems, when he's documented in his own autobiography about his struggles with drug addiction. What jumps out at me is that there does not appear to be what's called a felony false statement. And that was an issue that was specifically raised by the judge in Delaware in July. She said to the parties, I've had other cases before me here in Delaware, similar scenario, you have an admitted drug user and a gun possession, and the government has charged a felony false statement that can be a fine of around $250,000 and up to 5 years in prison. The government in this case said that they were comfortable not charging that. So here we are today. They have not charged it based on my reading of the indictment. They've instead charged him with lying on the form and then being in the possession of that weapon as a drug user. And so how will Hunter Biden's legal team then likely react and respond to this? I don't think we've received an official response to them, as this news has just broken in the past 30 minutes, but there aren't tax-related charges, but he is facing those charges elsewhere. How might they fight this? Through a motion to dismiss or what, based on your experience there in the courtroom over the summer? Well, I think with this case, we have to take it one indictment at a time. Yeah. They're facing now these gun charges. They have been litigating with the government over whether this diversion agreement is still valid. They've argued that it was signed by the prosecutors and by the defense attorneys, and that it's a valid agreement. The government has said that it was not a fully executed contract because it wasn't signed off on by the probation office. So we can expect them to litigate the validity of the diversion agreement, which would have allowed him to wipe the slate clean after 2 years with his felony gun offense and say, hey, wait a minute, you can't bring charges against our client on this because we have a valid, credible, standing agreement with the government. And we heard just a few moments ago some wondering if part of the Hunter Biden defense might be a Second Amendment defense. Like, might this go to a higher court if he argues that those types of restrictions on his ability to own a gun shouldn't exist in the first place? Is that possible? Well, there is litigation that's ongoing over whether it's constitutional to block someone who is a drug user from possessing a weapon. So they could certainly follow on with that litigation. I found it significant that the judge in Delaware, in light of that litigation, asked the government why they had not charged this separate element of a felony false statement, because that really is kind of a clean element to a gun case. But the government in that case, and it appears here, has chosen not to do so.
And I know you mentioned we'll deal with this one indictment at a time. Do you think there may be any impact on the tax-related charges he's also facing?
Well, what's so interesting about this case, Errol, is that it's bifurcated. And in simple terms, it means that there are two lanes. There is this tax lane, and then there's a gun lane. The tax lane will require the special counsel to go to a grand jury and seek an indictment on the charges. Either the likely venue would be California or here in Washington, D.C. The tax case is a complex case. It's always challenging to get that kind of case in front of a grand jury to get an indictment, and it can be even harder when you go to trial with a jury. What's bumping up against that is this testimony and claims from these IRS whistleblowers that they say firmly the evidence supported more serious charges in this case. They say it supported felony tax charges as well as misdemeanor tax charges. The reason that matters is that former Justice Department officials have told CBS News that there is a requirement by the government to charge the most serious offense and then plea down from that. So they're arguing that they violated their own rules when, under the original plea agreement, they were only looking at these misdemeanor tax charges. But that's kind of beside the point at this stage. Special Counsel Weiss is going to have to really start all over again on the tax case in another jurisdiction. But in the meantime, he's put before the Delaware court the gun charges, 3 related to the possession as a drug user.
Really fascinating to see how some of these are connected, disconnected, bifurcated. Catherine Herridge from our DC Bureau, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We want to reconnect now with CBS News legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School, Jessica Levinson. And it's difficult, I guess, for folks at home, Jessica, to separate the different aspects and legal vulnerabilities Hunter Biden faces. But just remind us how, then, the special counsel said they came to this decision.
Well, I mean, excellent reporting by Catherine Herridge, right, who was in the courtroom when that plea agreement fell apart. And that's how we are getting to this indictment today. So what they had, the Department of Justice had to alert the court if they were going to indict Hunter Biden. And they said, I believe a few days ago, yes, there is an indictment forthcoming. And the reporting indicated that it was going to be on these gun-related charges. And so in some ways, of course, this is unexpected, but in a lot of ways, it is completely predictable. You had a plea agreement. You had Hunter Biden admit that he essentially violated this law. And now you have charges brought up. And then, as Catherine laid out, there is a second lane here. And the question is what special counsel David Weiss decides to do with respect to those tax evasion charges that were the other part, that second part of the plea agreement. And obviously, we haven't seen those charges, but one has to imagine that because they were part of the original plea agreement, that there's a strong possibility that an indictment is forthcoming on them.
And so what would the strategy be then to bifurcate them? You know, the grand jury handed up this indictment based on the statements on these forms to purchase and possess a weapon. Why not include that as well? What does that tell us?
So I think, and I believe Catherine used the words clean, that this was the cleanest case in the sense that the gun possession charges and lying on this federal form were fairly straightforward. And I think what the Department of Justice decided is that this is the right jurisdiction for these charges, and the more complicated charges dealing with federal tax evasion may come in a separate jurisdiction. So we can, obviously, we've had a lot of experience talking about different indictments in different jurisdictions, but I expect part of what's happening is that the tax evasion charges may come in a different courthouse, still under special counsel David Weiss. The other thing is, you know, again, part of what we heard from the judge when the plea deal fell apart is, why are you lumping these two things together this way? And I think bringing these charges separately also answers that question.
Fascinating. Fascinating to think how what Judge Mary Ellen Norica did over the summer really did lead to the deal falling apart, and now these charges popping up just a short time later. What then happened next? And does Hunter Biden have the opening to enter another diversion program or or something separate because he was said to already be in one?
Yes. So the answer to that is I don't know what is going to happen with respect to the diversion program that was part of the plea agreement. So just to remind everybody, the plea agreement on the table that fell apart was Hunter Biden said, I'll enter a diversion program, I'll stay out of trouble for 2 years, and then essentially this will be wiped off of my record. That was part of the deal that fell apart. That's why we see these charges today. And I wish I could give you a clear answer on here's exactly what could happen with respect to another diversion program, but I don't know. We're now kind of at the beginning of this case. And so we have to see how exactly Hunter Biden responds and whether or not being part of a diversion program is a portion of his response.
Right. I mean, this news just breaking in the past 45 minutes, and we just want to bring our viewers the details of what we do know and the possible avenues now that this could move towards. We know that Hunter Biden's legal team are likely to file a motion to dismiss. We don't know that as a fact, but it's a possibility. And you had mentioned that they could also make an argument that there's a Second Amendment reason why these charges shouldn't be brought in the first place. Just remind us exactly why you think that is.
Yeah, this is something that I think is so interesting about this case because you have a situation where you might have Hunter Biden arguing as part of his defense, essentially that the Second Amendment should be read as broader and should protect people like him. So what are we talking about specifically? Hunter Biden is now facing 3 different charges, 2 for lying on a federal form, 1 for being essentially a drug user in possession of a gun. And part of his defense might be, well, at least one of these laws that you're charging me under, it can't be on the books. It's not constitutional because, for instance, the Second Amendment would prevent you, federal government, from putting limits on gun possession by a drug user. And we know, Errol, that this coming Supreme Court term that starts in about a month, the court is going to tackle a big gun control case dealing with whether or not you can prevent former domestic violence perpetrators from holding guns in certain situations. I'm being fairly broad here, but we also know that the court just 2 years ago came out with a ruling dealing with whether or not New York could restrict concealed carry permits, all of which is to say we have a court that wants to expand Second Amendment rights. And now we have the son of a Democratic president who might, as part of his defense, say, yes, expand those rights. I can't face these charges because some of the charges are unconstitutional under the current Supreme Court framework.
So Hunter Biden's legal team may already see an opening in appealing this case, at which point, again, this is many eventualities down the line, the Supreme Court would have to determine whether, yes, it's legal to have restrictions, which then opens the door for other firearms restrictions, or no, this isn't legal, which would wipe away a whole slew of restrictions, which, yes, New York, and we know the governor of New Mexico is trying to enlist their own types of nibbles around the edges of the Second Amendment right.
I would say what I think the governor of New Mexico is doing is more of a broad-based attack on the Supreme Court's current case law. And I suspect that will be struck down very quickly. But yes, I mean, it would be remarkable if another case dealing with gun control comes to the Supreme Court and it involves Hunter Biden's defense. For that reason, because I think it would be somewhat remarkable, I have to think that this particular Supreme Court may not want to take that case in the sense of that's a political hot potato. If and when you and I ever talked about that case, it would be what happened in the Hunter Biden case. It wouldn't be what happened in this big Second Amendment case. And so I think this court, even though they're very motivated to expand Second Amendment rights, they might want to do it through another case that does not involve the president's son.
Still fascinating to think about and consider. Jessica Levinson, always great to chat with you about this breaking story. We appreciate it. Let's now look at the political angle of all of this with CBS News political director Finn Gomez. Finn, the president's son, indicted on 3 counts as it relates to owning a weapon and lies he allegedly said about his drug use. And this is as the House has approved an impeachment inquiry into President Biden to see if his son's business dealings in any way benefited the president. How is Capitol Hill and Republicans there, how are they likely to react to this?
I think politically they're going to react to it as is expected, in the sense that they're going to say that it fits in their narrative of in their narrative of some wrongdoing, of potential wrongdoing, of some influence peddling. But it doesn't really fit what they're essentially alleging and on the Hill in this impeachment inquiry, which is more about the alleged bribery scheme. It's not what this is about. So I think, but however, politically, I think what you're already hearing on the campaign trail, I think what you're hearing on the Hill is, they're basically pointing over to these indictments and saying, "See, I told you so."
And Finn, this is happening as the presidential re-election campaign gears up. How might this shift that, impact it? It certainly adds another dimension for President Biden.
Well, if you look at the most recent national polling on President Biden's performance as president, he has not done very well. He's been sort of struggling as of late, and I don't think this will is expected to help those numbers. And also, I think that it has this sort of cloud over a little bit over his administration, I think, and also it serves as a the Republicans can already again weaponize this on the campaign trail. You are already hearing a lot about this in the early states where the Republican candidates are traveling to and campaigning on this. They allege corruption. They attack them on various fronts, and I think this plays into their rhetoric politically. But I think it's still a little bit of a wait and see approach to see how legitimate that is.
And Finn, just remind us, we're watching footage from February with President Biden and his son Hunter exiting, I think that was Air Force One, or it always is when the president is traveling.
It is.
How visible has Hunter Biden been in recent months? And in what ways has the president spoken about him, his son Hunter, and his addiction issues?
I mean, he's been very public about that, Errol, and he loves his son. It's his son. It's his only son. If you remember, his other son, Beau, passed away a few years back. So I think that when you look at it from that perspective, it's a very personal relationship. He loves his son. He said so publicly, and he has not shied away from that. And Hunter Biden has been very public and has attended some White House functions, and you do see him publicly often. So I don't think that has been a factor for that. But I think, again, politically, it could serve as a target for Republican hits against the president and his reelection hopes, as you know, Errol, right in the middle of this election cycle. And, if just a reminder, the next presidential debate is less than 2 weeks away. It's going to be held at the Reagan Library in California, and this will most likely be a very well talked about topic.
And Finn, what have Republicans who are campaigning for the Republican nomination said about the president's son and his legal troubles?
I mean, especially if you look at the impeachment inquiry launched by House Republicans, it mirrors the rhetoric that you hear from the former president, who is still essentially the standard bearer for the Republican Party, and the front runner, the clear front runner right now in this presidential primary race. I mean, they're very similar, and I think that this plays very significantly on that side of the political football. And I think, you will be hearing a lot of this. You've been hearing a lot of it already. I think that, that these accusations, these allegations that they say show some untoward behavior, some, again, some alleged bribery schemes. And, you hear, Biden and corruption a lot in their talking points. And I think this will only be amplified in the coming weeks. I think we're already hearing and seeing it on social media platforms, and I think we'll be hearing a lot at a cattle call that's happening in Iowa and Des Moines this weekend also, where the majority of the Republican primary field will be in attendance.
It's a very good point. Finn Gomez, that's the latest from our CBS News political director. We appreciate all of that, Finn. Just want to get another question in to our legal contributor, Jessica Levinson, still connected and listening in. Jessica, one question for you is, what happens now from the Hunter Biden legal team? Do they take some kind of other plea agreement or take another path?
If another plea agreement is offered, I mean, this is the result of a plea agreement that fell apart. And let's remember, this indictment did not come 5 hours after that agreement fell apart. This indictment came a good deal later, meaning you have to assume that the sides talked and they tried to come to some sort of agreement. You also have to assume that Hunter Biden's legal team really wanted to avoid what he's facing right now, which is the possibility, not the probability, but the possibility that he could face a maximum of 25 years in federal prison. So if another agreement is offered, maybe. Most cases don't go to trial. So I'm very purposely not giving you a definitive answer because I just think there's no way to project it out other than to say they've tried once and probably more.
All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you for that. Our thanks also to Nancy Cordes, Catherine Herridge, and Finn Gomez on this breaking news that the president's son, Hunter Biden, now indicted on federal gun charges. We will stand by as we hear from the president here within the next few moments. Stay with us on CBS News to see what he has to say about the economy. We don't expect him to discuss this, but who knows? Stay with us as we continue our special coverage on CBS News.
It's important to our nation.
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside